Hello everyone, I'm Jessica Kramer with MRC-TV. Today we're speaking with Mary Rice Hassan, a lawyer and fellow with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, to discuss the Equality Act, what all that entails, and what's coming down the pike if it passes. Mary, thank you so much for taking the time to unpack this for us.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you're doing this topic. It is such an important piece of legislation.
Yes. The Equality Act could very well be the most dangerous part of President Biden's agenda so far. For those unfamiliar with it, what is it generally, and why is it such a pending threat?
Well, it's a comprehensive piece of legislation that attempts to alter the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is our basic anti-discrimination law. And so what it does is it adds new categories, sexual orientation and gender identity, but it redefines sex, and it applies this new definition throughout all of the civil rights statutes. So basically what it's doing is taking the ruling from the Supreme Court last summer in the Bostock decision, which redefines sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's just putting that throughout the whole of government. And one of the really dangerous aspects of this is not just that it creates these new categories, which are now going to be protected classifications of sexual orientation and gender identity. One of the really dangerous aspects of it is that it specifically disallows the Religious Freedom Restoration Act from being a defense to an accusation of discrimination. So what that means is, if you think back to some of the cases we've had over the past few years, for example, over the Affordable Care Act, where the Little Sisters of the Poor were in court defending their right to their own religious freedom and saying to the government, you cannot force us to violate our conscience. But under the Equality Act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act would not be available as a defense. And so even though we still have the First Amendment, it narrows the realistic ability of people to defend their religious freedom. So it's a dangerous bill. It also has implications for the abortion issue because of the way pregnancy discrimination is defined and the right to treatment. So this is just such a far-reaching bill. I think of it as like an octopus, with the federal government, just this huge creature that is just reaching into every aspect of our lives. And that's really what this will do.
Yeah, you touched on so many aspects of the bill. Just to kind of backtrack a little bit, one thing that I found really interesting was the Impact Fund endorses the bill, and the way that they explained it on their website is, quote, the Equality Act updates a list of protected groups and a number of civil rights laws by clarifying that sex includes sexual orientation, gender identity. But the one aspect that I found really interesting was it defines gender identity as the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, other gender-related characteristics of a person, obviously defines sexual orientation, but sex is also defined as including, quote, a sex stereotype and including intersex traits. I don't know if you know anything about this, but that was a new thing for me. Any idea what those mean, and how does that differ from gender identity?
So what they're trying to do is really explode the idea of what sex means. And sex means male and female. It comes from science, right? It's the binary division of human beings according to your reproductive role. There's only two. But what this does is it says, no, when the law says sex, we're going to read into that and write into it through the Equality Act, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so this sex stereotypes is meant to protect gender expression, anything you do, whether in your hair, your actions, or whatever that might be considered stereotypical. Even they're categorizing as a sex stereotype, even the assumption, for example, that males would marry females. Now that was for millennia. That was part of our law. That was part of cultural understanding, but that's being reduced to a sex stereotype. And I've seen language in other briefs and things that are argued by the same people pushing this, where they would argue that it's a sex stereotype, for example, to believe that a male-bodied person should identify as a male instead of being able to identify as a woman or anything else. So biology, the truth about the person, all of these things are being dismissed as not just sex stereotypes, but as discriminatory or bigoted sex stereotypes. So, it affects everything from language, from our religious practice to the laws to what's going to come into the public schools in curriculum materials for our children. And you mentioned the intersex thing. That's another angle. One of the tactics really that those who are pushing this bill and similar things on the state level often do is they try to confuse the issue between those who are born with some sort of physical prenatal defect in development of their sexual organs, or sometimes it's chromosomal or something like that, where it's harder to tell. And you don't want someone to be discriminated on that basis. But medicine deals with that. This is something different. The whole transgender thing, there's nothing wrong with someone's body. The body is perfectly healthy. It's just that the person is rejecting that sexual identity and choosing to identify in a different way according to their feelings, or because they want to identify with sex stereotypes and such. So what this does is it destroys the meaning of words.
Yes.
In language.
Yes, and you had touched on that it threatens religious freedom. On their website, I just could not get over this. They wrote, "The bill declares that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act cannot serve as a defense to enforcement actions under the Civil Rights Act." I mean, talk about imposing beliefs on society. And I think it's such a blatant example of how cunning liberalism is, because it's asserting a worldview, but they're acting like they're not because they're imposing relativism and not, quote, religion. As a lawyer, do you think that there are going to be challenges to this in court, and what could be the fallout of that?
Absolutely. And two things of interest. One, Ryan Anderson, who is now at the Ethics and Public Policy, obviously he's our new president, often speaks about how anti-discrimination law is designed to be a shield. It's designed to protect people. But what's happening with this Equality Act is that these provisions are designed to be a sword in the hand of those who want to change American society according to a progressive agenda. So instead of the shield, the anti-discrimination laws become the sword. So this is it's a very serious threat to religious freedom, because these beliefs, even just the ability, as the Supreme Court has recognized, the ability to recognize the truth about the person, that you're male or female, or that males and females marry, and that traditionally has been viewed as marriage, that these ideas and beliefs then are going to be viewed as discriminatory or bigoted. And it's a sea change. It is just a huge change for the law, for our culture, and it's going to repress free speech, repress religion. It's going to threaten parental rights. It's just, we could talk for 2 hours on the implications of this.
I know, I bet you could. Well, another aspect of this, and I think it's so funny that you brought up Ryan Anderson, this is a perfect system for predators, I think, of women. Because if I were a male criminal, all I have to do is declare myself a woman, and immediately I gain full access to female spaces. And Ryan Anderson, I saw his statement that the EPPC released, and he says, he's like, it's important not only to treat transgenderism as a mental disorder rather than a reality, but it's also imperative to protect women in all of this. And they're the more vulnerable sex, and they're the ones that are going to be taken advantage of. So what do you see as the dangers, some of the dangers at least, that will be placed in women if this law passes?
So there are a number of them. One is just the whole idea of who is a woman. And so under this law, you're a woman if you say you're a woman. And what that does is effectively erase all of the gains that we've made for females by acknowledging sex-based rights in the law and in the culture, making room for that. And instead, just saying, well, it doesn't really matter that you're a female with particular vulnerabilities, a typical life course, pregnancy needs, things like that. Instead, it's just all self-defined. And so there are serious implications for both safety and privacy, because under this law, if it passes, the idea of having single-sex bathrooms, locker rooms, private spaces, gyms just for women would go out the window. Housing or shelters for homeless women. All of those things would be required by law to be opened up to anyone who identifies as a woman, which, you're a woman. We all know women who've been sexually assaulted, who have suffered from male aggression in different ways. For a woman in that circumstance, whether she's in the hospital room, whether she's in a homeless shelter, whether she's just walking into her doctor's office, for her not to have the right to say, I want to be treated only by another woman, another female, and to have the law say, well, no, that's discriminatory for you to say that. You have to be willing to accept anyone who identifies as a woman, even if it's a full-bodied male. And so it just it creates danger, because even though one of the standard things that the other side often says is, you're saying that all these people who identify as transgender are somehow aggressive and criminal. And on the one hand, it's not true that there are no instances of assault by people who identify as transgender. There's a website called Women Are Human, which tracks a lot of the criminal assault cases and issues arising around that. But the bigger problem is you're telling young girls that their natural defenses don't matter. That when someone walks in who looks like they're a male, you can't question it. You can't insist on the right to your space. You're not allowed to say, I'm showering here. I'm not comfortable with you as a male, because their physical sex doesn't matter, or at the very least, your recognition of their physical sex is delegitimized. It's considered non-discriminatory or bigoted. It would be considered. So these are privacy issues. They're safety issues. They're also going to affect women's gains. All the different programs we have for women, whether it's STEM programs, whether you have different things that came into being because women needed extra space or a leg up or training or whatever it might be to have full opportunities in society. All of that now is just open to anyone who identifies as women. So again, who counts as a woman? Well, what this is saying is that someone who identifies as transgender gets to define who counts as a woman.
Well, this is also the second go-round of the Equality Act. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, she is a rising female star in the Republican Party, voted for it the first time around, and Terry Schilling over at American Principles Project called for Republicans who voted for this to be voted out of office. Do you agree? Should this be something adopted by Republican voters and Republican members of Congress?
So here's what I would like to see. I've been very impressed with Representative Stefanik, and I think she's done a tremendous job on many issues. And I wonder if it would be helpful to sit down and to talk through these implications. Because I think if you just listen to the hype that's out there, if you listen to the other side's talking points, and you think, I'm a good person, I don't like to discriminate, therefore I go with, hey, this Equality Act sounds great. You have to get down to the details and realize what this means. So that if she decides to cast that vote, she realizes she's voting in a way that says to that woman who's a sexual assault survivor, no, you don't have the right to say when a male nurse comes in who's identifying as a woman that you don't want to be examined by him, that you want to have a female, that you're saying when you vote for this, she no longer has that right because that would be discriminatory towards that person on the basis of gender identity. So making this real to people, to these different legislators, those 8 Republicans who previously voted for it, to say, do you understand what is actually going to be the fruit of this? And are you prepared to face the voters? Because there's an amazing coalition of women who are from radical feminists to people of religious faith to people who are just common sense, ordinary people who say there's something not right about this. We know there's a difference between male and female. These legislators who vote for that are going to be facing those voters who are not going to be happy.
Yeah. What are the odds of this thing passing?
I think it'll pass the House. I think in the Senate, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult. And I think the more that we can educate people as to the real consequences of this act and the fact that, in a sense, we really don't know the limits of this. It is just so broad in terms of redefining what counts as a public accommodation. In other words, where the government gets to regulate spaces that the government gets to regulate in terms of civil rights law. The Act greatly expands that. The term gender identity, what does it mean? You can define it in that statute, but because it ultimately depends on a person's self-identity, what really is the objective nature of that? And then what does this mean for women? And then finally, budgetary. I looked at the Congressional Budget Office, the analysis of what this would cost. Every bill they have to assess. And the last analysis was when it was originally introduced, but they vastly underestimate the lawsuits that are going to be arising out of this. So the cost for the federal government is going to be much more than I think that little document anticipates. So
I bet. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your expertise on this issue.
thank you. Thank you for covering it.
All right.
For all of you.
Thank you.